Hi and welcome to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day today. For the free tutorial project here on YouTube today, we're going to be working on an ear wrap. Now this is not necessarily a cuff which would go around the cartilage of the ear, but a wrap which goes over the top of the whole ear and dangles down. Now I've got a couple of samples to share with you. There's one with Swarovski cup chain lengths added in, and I will show you these on the board in just a second. Now these are perfectly suitable for people with zero piercings in their ear, and it's a lovely way to accent the ear with some gorgeous movement as well. So let's head down to the board and take a closer look at those projects. So here's one example that I made earlier using copper colour wire, antique bronze colour heart chain and a couple of gold colour charms just at either end of the design. Now this is a really beginner friendly design, and as mentioned it can be worn by people with no piercings in the ear. So I'm going to show you the two pieces that I'm wearing myself today. Let's just pop this one out of the way. So this item has got slightly larger gold heart chain with a bead attached via a little head pin down at the base, and I've also used jump rings to attach each of those lengths of chains. So there are two ways that you can work this design. You can add your chain directly into the loops as we move through, and I will show you both options, or you can add them on afterwards. I'll just grab the cup chain ear cuff that I have as well. This is particularly festive, so if you fancy just a little bit of extra sparkle. Now this is quite a diminutive one, but you get the punch because of the Swarovski crystals there. They're really sparkly in evening lights. And this one is just huge, and it's very, very comfortable to wear. Now there are a couple of things that I want to talk you through when we come to create this project. If I just grab this piece for a second. I've created each of those loops sequentially, and what that means when I take that off the ear form is that the wire starts to move forwards as you build up. So what you have to do is just bring that back around and apply a little bit of bending to that form. Let's just pop that one out of the way. With this design, I wrapped one loop in one direction and then reverse the direction. You end up with a much straighter form that sits down underneath and to the rear of the ear, but what it does do is it looks a bit different. So when you look at those loops you can see that they're not cascading naturally down. So there are two ways that you can attack the project, and I will show you those as we move through. I'm absolutely 100% guaranteed to knock these flying at some point today. With the cup chain section, there's only 4 loops, as I say, because I just wanted to rely on the sparkle of those crystals instead of the sheer quantity of movement with the other piece. Now, as I say, I probably will knock these at some point. In terms of wire, I'm going to be working with 1mm or 18 gauge wire, and the reason I've chosen this wire is because it is a comfortable weight on and behind the ear. It really doesn't take any effort to wear this. There's no dragging or anything. I tend to wear quite large earrings myself through my pierced lobes, and that can be a little bit uncomfortable on long evenings, but these are really delightful to wear. So I have around about 13 inches of that 1mm or 18 gauge wire, and the first thing that I will do, as ever, is make sure that that is really lovely and warm and smooth and ready to work. I have previously flush cut both ends of this, although we're quite likely to trim some away. So in order to attach to the ear itself, just up at the top, we're going to start with a loop which will sit just at the front. Now you will need to fit this per individual ear, or advise, if you're selling mail order, advise your client to very, very softly just open or close the design up to form fit their particular ear. Every single one is different. We will start with either round nose pliers or your bail makers. I'm going to use my memory wire pliers, and we're going to start by creating about 2/3 of a circular form. Once we've created that 2/3 or so of the circular form, what we're going to do is grip that with flat facing pliers and just complete that circle up. You can go for a slightly open coil if you want, but I'm going to go for a closed coil because I think it is much less likely to catch in people's hair. So I'm going to go for 2 rotations around that central aperture, give that a bit of a squish and a squeeze to work hard on it, and that will be my jumping off point. Now if you are working with chain, you don't need to worry about which ear it's going to fit. If you're working with a one-sided drop, such as the Swarovski cup chain here, you will need to form fit. So this is a left ear design because the sparkle is sitting in such a way that it will only be seen from that angle. So the next thing we're going to do is to create that little beautiful curve or arc over the top of the ear. Now this will vary from individual to individual, but I tend to start off just by using my thumb to generate that nice smooth arc form and just fit it around a little bit. What you will find is because we're working with that 1mm gauge wire, it's relatively easy to form fit that to an individual when you've completed the project. So we've got our little attachment at the front, which you can barely feel in wear. Do make sure that that is work hardened with a little bit of open and closing with your flat facing pliers. Make sure it's well and truly strong, and make sure that the end of the wire, the cut end of the wire, sits fully inside that circular form, so it's not going to catch on any hair or any other jewellery that might be being worn. So I'm just going to warm through that first section really nicely, because I want to start creating some loops. Now if you imagine that the ear sits on the human head, not completely upright like so, but at a gentle slant back. Most ears are slightly slanted, but you may need to address that later. If there is a huge deviation from what you're expecting, it can be fitted. But what we don't want to do is start creating the loops all the way up here, because otherwise the chain will just dangle around the back of the ear and you won't have that lovely cascading effect that we're looking for. So we're going to just flip this over. I'm right-handed, so I'm going to create it in this direction. It's just a little bit easy for me. So if we imagine that this is now coming down the rear slope of the ear, what we can do is grab our round nose pliers, or in my case, I'm going to use my little memory wire pliers. Now I'm going to go for quite small loops on this one, because I just think it looks nice, basically. What we're going to do is just hold that down at an angle and create a loop all the way around. Now that's going to just come out of vision for a second as I bring that all the way around, and I've taken the pin of my pliers out to just switch that over. What we're looking to create is a flat baseline, and if I show you this sideways, you'll see that we have a continuation of wire. I'm going to warm that through again because I want it to remain smooth and fluid. What I'm looking for here is a straight transition, so we're going to create a loop and then continue along with the cut end of the wire. And we need to have a nice flat section here. 1, because it looks more attractive if that is flat, and 2, we want this to be as comfortable as possible. Now if there is a slight deviation, you can use your fine tipped bent chain nose pliers to just pop in the baseline there, push that wire along so you get that nice continuation. Now you'll notice that I'm leaving the arc in the wire here because it makes it easier for me to judge how far I want to go around adding those loops. So I'm just going to add 4 loops to this design today, but you can add as many as you feel necessary. This one entirely encases the ear and comes down just below the lobe itself, and I think that looks really beautiful, but you don't need to see the same technique over and over again. So if we are going to recreate the design where the loop goes one way and then the other way, you'll notice that the wire I'm working with has come around and then it passes back and underneath. If you wanted to have this kind of design where it's a very straight line and you don't have to form fit it later, your next wire will come up and around and then the tail will pass over the top. Now my preference is actually to have these all cascading down in the same direction, and I'll show you exactly what I mean now. So I'm going to put the pin of those pliers in again with the side I want to use on the outside of the ear cuff, or wrap if you prefer. So if I push that wire all the way around, when I get to here I need to decide if I want to bring this tail of wire over the top so that I have this effect of one loop one way, one loop the other way, or if I want to go for, I will bring the other design in, this type, which is where the loops all move in the same direction, but you just have to work a little bit harder later to get them to sit flatter. For me, I will always keep them all going in the same direction. I just wanted to create this one as an alternative for you. So you can see on the first loop we've created, the wire comes over the top first, runs around and then passes underneath. So I'm going to do that again. Bring that all the way around. It comes slightly out of focus for a second. Bring that all the way around. Think about how far apart you want those loops to sit. And then just warm that wire through again, keeping it fluid as you're working. And then what we want to do is just tilt these loops so that they sit at the same level, very, very softly and gently modifying that position. Push the wire back down so you get that straight base line. Now, if you want to add your chain directly into these loops, it makes it incredibly difficult to demonstrate. But what you would need to do is every time you do either one or two, you just open up each of those loops. So I'm just going to open up this second loop gently. Just pull that wire away so that you can see into that coil as it moves around. I've got a piece of chain somewhere, I think. I'm going to come all the way along to the cut end, pop that through the end of my chain. Now all of my chain lengths are the same number of links, and that's because you're looking for the cascade to be nice and natural. If you try to make one longer, then one longer, then one longer, it kind of looks artificial. So I went for the same number of links in every piece and used the curvature of the wrap itself to give me that cascading effect. You can push that loop all the way, the loop of the chain all the way down. You may need to open it out slightly more. This is quite a funny shaped chain that I'm using. It's a heart shape. So just open that loop out and you can slide your chain into position on the loop. Now, if you want to, you can do that all the way along. So we can move that piece of chain into the next position. Again, you might need to just open that out slowly. And what you can do is just support the lower part of the loop and pull that apart on one side. And then you can slide that chain all the way around into that first position. So you can do that all the way along, just one piece at a time. So if I just flip this back into the orientation we were working with before, you'll see that you can sight the chain directly into the loops. Even if you've done 6 or 7 of those loops, you just need to open each one out and slide the piece of chain along. Once you've sighted the chain, you can close that up neatly, like so. You will then continue all the way along, adding as many or as few loops as you like. As I mentioned, I'm going to go for 4 today. So I just want to make sure that I'm happy with how that preceding loop is sitting before I warm that wire through again and grab in my pliers. Bring the wire all the way around my chosen pin. I'm going to show you how to fix a problem that may occur. So if I bring this all the way around, I know that I want my wire to come underneath because I'm going to do the same thing. And what you may notice is that there's a difference in the gap between those loops. I like to have the loops quite close together, but if you wanted to have them further apart, then by all means do so. But the idea of the cascade of chain is that it is regularly spaced. So in order to bring that loop a little bit further along, so it's closer to the preceding loop, I'm just going to use those pliers to bring the loop into position. I'm happy that that third loop is now in the right place. I'm just going to switch the direction, push the wire over, and then take a second to make sure that that baseline is flattened down. And obviously every time you add a loop, you can add a piece of chain. It just makes it tricky to demonstrate, and frankly a bit fiddly to demonstrate because that gets caught in my hands. So I'm going to stop the camera for a second now and add a few more loops. I haven't decided how many, but we will just move along that design for a few more minutes and I'll be right back with you. So I've continued along my merry little way and I've created 7 loops. I think 7's quite a nice number. And what has happened, because I'm always moving those loops in the same direction, is that the wire is starting to twist and build off away from the ear, or conversely, if you're moving in the opposite direction, it'll be getting too close to the area behind the ear. So I'm going to show you now how to straighten that up and an alternative way to add chain to each of those loops if you want to simplify your life slightly. Well, let's head back down to the board and we'll move on through the next part of the tutorial. So as you build your loops into that ear wrap, what happens is you have this effect of the wire moving in a slightly squiggly way. So it's less than comfortable if you do this. So we just need to address that before we move on with the next section. So as you can see, the wire naturally builds up and away. So what we're going to do is just very, very carefully slightly twist, and just bring all of those into a good straight line. We can add a little bit of warmth to that tail, and it's just a case of very gently creating a slightly straighter baseline. So if you add your chains in first, just be careful that you don't crush them. And what I'm doing very, very soft-handedly is just slightly twisting, and I was doing this by hand a second ago, but I want to show you the technique. Is I'm just slightly twisting, and slightly twisting, and then what you can do is just manually adjust that until you see it sitting flat on the board. So it can take a little while, and you may need to play around with that starting point as well. One of the reasons for not adding all of the chain is that it gets very difficult to see. So it's a case of going slowly. We warmed this wire really beautifully before we made each of those loops, so you can just take your time, and eventually that will come close enough to being flat on the board. And whilst the human head isn't exactly flat, it's really good if we can get this cuff flat to begin with, so that there's no deviation that can be causing uncomfortableness on the back of the ear. So we are looking for a straighter line across that curved arc there. There's not too much deviation with those round forms pushing forwards towards where it will sit against the ear. What we're looking again for as well is just to make sure that this is going to fit. So you can just try that. If you're making for yourself, just continue to try that on. If you're making for somebody else, I can thoroughly recommend having a little ear form just to give you an idea. And it's also a really nice selling tool, and no, I don't sell them. It's just fallen on its face. That's always good. So when you've added as many loops and as many pieces of chain as you want to do, we're just going to give that a little bit of a warm through at the end, and I think I'm going to trim a couple of inches of wire away. We've started with around about 13 inches, and I've cut now a tail of about 2.5 inches. The reason I cut a tail of 2.5 inches is because it gives me an opportunity to generate a double wrapped coil up at the as we did at the top, at the bottom. And it usually takes, if you start with a very small moment in the middle, it takes about 1 inch to 1.25 inches, which will also leave us a tail just beneath the last loop and before you add that finishing coil. So let's just grab those pliers again. Start by rotating around kind of 2/3 of the way into that circle. If you grip the rest of that circular form, you can then push it all in and you end up with a slightly centralised middle bit. So I'm going to chase that around until I've got 2 passes of wire. So I've got that double coil with an open centre. Again, I'm going to finish off by giving that a really good squish. Now, if you're very, very careful, you can grab your block and hammer the sections that are straight single passes of wire. So you could hammer all the way at this end and you could hammer all the way around here. But what I would say is that the 1mm wire, one of the reasons for using it is that it's flexible and you can just change this up to fit an individual's ear. So I wouldn't overly hammer it if you are going to hammer it. You also, if you leave it just work hardened by pliers, you can also just make minor adjustments to fit people's preferences as well at the point of sale, if for instance you're selling at a fair. So I can just take that slightly smaller if I want to. Now that overall is pretty much the tutorial done, but I'm going to show you an alternative way that you can add chain. Now, anytime you make a connection in wire jewellery, there is a risk. So one of the reasons I much prefer to add the chain directly into the loops is that the chain itself is a risk of breaking, but jump rings, unless you take the time to solder them, have the capacity to just open enough to drop the chain perhaps. So the choices are absolutely yours. Let me just grab this fella again. So in this one I put all of those individual bits of chain directly onto the wire cuff or wire wrap if you prefer. But if you don't want to do that, and also down at the base, you can use yourself a jump ring to add that in. And this is a huge brass jump ring that I'm using to demonstrate with. It doesn't really fit the aesthetic of the piece I'm making, but it just makes it easier to show you. So you can add a piece in at the base as well as at the top, or into each of the loops you've created. Now I'm lazy like a sausage today, so I'm just going to close that up by hand. You can obviously get yourself a really lovely saw cut jump ring and do that professionally, but the idea is that you can add into your design with jump rings if you prefer. So you've got a couple of examples there, and I'll take a photograph of these pieces and leave them on the outro of the video. So you've got lots of options with the ear wrap or ear cuff if you prefer. You can have charms top and bottom, as I have done with this one. And then the rear loops just have chain in them. I love how that one feels. Or you might prefer to go for beads on the end, which is just a wrapped loop on a head pin on each of those chain ends. Or as I showed you earlier, some of the cup chain variety. So I'll just take a quick photo of these and leave that with you now. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a beautiful day today. All the very best for the winter festivities. Lots of love. Bye for now.